right, so I am here with Jacqueline. She's the anxious therapist, and we're going to be talking today about anxiety as well as trauma and, her experience with anxiety as well as trauma and the services that she provides to help people with coping with anxiety and moving through trauma. So thank you so much for being here, Jacqueline. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and, why you're qualified to work with and help people with anxiety?
Totally. So first of all, I'm humbled and grateful to be here. So thank you so much for having me. Yes, I'm Jacqueline and I'm the anxious therapist. And I will start right off by saying I am both a licensed professional clinical counselor and I have an anxiety disorder. And that was something that was really hard for me to come to terms with. So I'll just share a little bit about my story, how I got here. I grew up in a blended family. And in that, I learned to be really fearful of conflict and wanted to be a people pleaser because if other people, being my parents, were happy and then we didn't see as much conflict, and I feared the conflict and I was just trying to avoid that at all costs. So I was, the three sport athlete who never rebelled, who got straight A's, had a 4.0. And people were always telling me things like, gosh, you're so mature for your age. You're so mature. And I was always beaming, thinking that was the best compliment. Like how cool that I'm 9, 10, 11 years old and people are telling me already how mature I am. I sit at the grown-ups table. I'm a part of grown-up conversations. Like this is the life, right? And so it wasn't until obviously I got a bit older, I moved away from home for college and things like that, that I started realizing that people pleasing really just meant that my needs were never being met. Nobody was emotionally available for me. And that is of no fault of their own, right? When we know better, we do better. And now my family knows better and we have this more mutual respect. But like, I have really young parents who were going through a divorce with two young children. And I really believe that they were doing the best that they could. So that's been a huge part of my own healing journey. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But once I got out of school, high school, and I got into college, I did not know that I had anxiety. I didn't know that my perfectionistic tendencies, my desire to always be in control, and my people-pleasing ways, I didn't know that those are symptoms of anxiety, but I knew that I wanted to go to school to be a therapist after losing my best friend to suicide when I was 12 years old. That life-changing experience, from then on, I knew I needed to do more to help people that around me, and make an impact and create this legacy. And so I went to college to become a therapist, not knowing that I had any mental health issues of my own. And so in order to cope, in order to make friends, in order to fit in, I developed a drinking habit and I became an alcoholic, drinking 4 days a week. I was failing classes. I wasn't going to classes. I was going to classes under the influence. I was going to classes hungover. And as someone who, graduated in the top of my class in high school and was this phenomenal athlete, like I no longer had sports. I no longer cared about my grades and I just completely rebelled. I disconnected from my family. It was like these people, my family that I was so close to and I spent every waking moment with. Like in high school, I wasn't the kid who was like, it's a Friday night, I'm out with my friends. I was home hanging out with my family because I wanted them to be happy. So I went from hanging out with them 24/7 in high school to college, partying, not talking to them for months at a time, completely distanced. And that went on for a few years. I kind of got it together, got my grades up, stopped failing classes, but I was still partying like crazy. And it was all just to cope with these huge emotions that I was clueless about. I didn't know I had anxiety. I didn't know, but I felt good to be the life of the party, to be the one who just didn't care anymore. And so that went on for quite a while until about grad school, I started going, Jacqueline, this might be a problem. Like, let's really hit the ground running with grad school. Let's dig in. And so I wouldn't say that I got totally sober, but I definitely got my life together a little bit. I started working in the field. And it was at that point that I realized I wanted to work with teens. I think that had always been my passion, just knowing that I lost my best friend when we were 12 to mental illness, it was like kind of a no-brainer. And so I started working in the field. I loved it. And I've now been a therapist for 4 years. I have 3 years in the adolescent day treatment world. And then now I've been in private practice for just over a year, and I work with adolescents and adults, but I specialize in trauma and co-occurring disorders. So I love chemical dependency, and that's I just like eat it up, can't get enough of it. So that's kind of where I come from, how I got here. And I also have been on a really extensive 3-year healing journey at this point of my own. I've done my own trauma therapy for a year. I've hired coaches. I've, really invested a lot of time into my own healing so that I can truly lead by example for my clients.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That definitely sounds like quite the journey. And, I'm hearing that growing up, a lot of the relationship with your parents and that conflict that you experienced really resulted in you wanting to be, overachieving and people pleasing and avoiding any of that conflict. So after that, it seems like there was a shift where you changed from that like high achieving behavior then to more of, like you said, you got into drinking and partying. So what do you think contributed to that shift for you?
Yeah, it was like I needed an outlet. I just wanted to feel seen and heard for the first time in my life, not patted on the back because I was a great athlete or a bright student, but I wanted to figure out who the heck I was. And the crowd I fell in with was partiers, and so they loved me. They thought my energy was great. They were like, let's, get her drunk as quick as we can tonight because she's going to do crazy things and we're all going to laugh and have a good time. And, like saying it like that, it's not like I was being bullied by my friends or anything, but they were like, you're awesome. You're fun. And I started taking a lot of pride in that. Again, I just wanted people to like find things about me that would make me feel accepted. And that was it at the time. Looking back on it now, I had no idea who I was. I didn't take the time to figure out who I was in high school or even my early 20s. I'm now 28 years old, finally going, I think we've kind of pinpointed it. Like, I think I know who I am now. But it's still a journey every single day.
Yeah, and I think that can really speak to the different ways that anxiety can show up and can look. Because, although it's something people talk about a lot, I think it can have a lot of different manifestations. And so can you just speak more to that in like your personal experience and also what you've seen in working with clients, like the ways that anxiety might show up differently?
Yes, exactly. So for me, I think the thing that people don't realize is these maladaptive ways of coping early on in life. Like I said, my people pleasing, my perfectionism, and my need to always be in control. Like those are the three things that people don't associate with anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
But those were all the things that were leading to my panic attacks. I had like the year I chose to invest in a coach and invest in therapy and just like go all in on my healing and withdraw from pretty much everything, just like go to work, go to my therapy appointments and just try to I was white knuckling it, right? Like it was 26 years of not addressing my mental health. And so I had to just kind of like buckle down and be like, okay, we're just going to invest this year of our life and then, hope for the best. And in doing that, it brought so much awareness to things that I once prided myself on. We learn these coping mechanisms and we take a lot of pride in it. We're like, everybody loves me. Everybody comes to me for advice and support. Everybody relies on me for these things. And that feels great until it doesn't anymore, until you're so drained because everybody's relying on you for everything. And because nobody's following boundaries because you haven't set any, this lack of boundaries and thinking like I had convinced myself I was such a good person, and that I was the best because I was always available emotionally or otherwise for everybody else until I realized I ended up resenting people. Like I had to push people away because I was like, you walk all over me, But how can I be upset at them for that when I never set a boundary saying you are not allowed to walk all over me? And so these things that we pride ourselves on, if I could, encourage who's ever listening right now to really just self-reflect on what are the behaviors, because we say things like, oh gosh, I'm a hot mess, I'm such a perfectionist, I'm a control freak. Stop priding yourself on that and take a look at, like, where did that come from? What purpose is that serving in my life? Why is this this behavior still occurring? I remained a people pleaser because I was afraid of conflict. I remained a control freak because I didn't want to delegate, because it delegating meant I had to trust other people and let people in. I wanted to remain, a perfectionist because then I was just procrastinating, waiting to do anything that I wanted to do because it made me feel anxious, but it was fulfilling all of those needs. And if we can just look at those kinds of things, like those maladaptive ways of coping. I, for the longest time, thought that my worst coping skill while all of this was happening was drinking. I thought that's my crutch. Like, that was the thing that I used to mask my anxiety. But really, it was all those other behaviors that I just listed too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of great points, and I think that it can be common to see that things like perfectionism or wanting to be in control, it's complicated because it's adaptive in some ways. It's adaptive to be a perfectionist when it's resulting in a 4.0 GPA.
Right.
But then at the same time, it appears like you were struggling on the inside, and it was really impacting your relationships and your mental health and the way that you felt.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes. And that's why I say, it's easy to look back and beat ourselves up. Like, why was I doing that? Why did I ever think that was okay? But if we can acknowledge that it was serving a purpose, we can say, it's easy for us to say now, that was so maladaptive, that was so unhealthy. But looking back, like, it got us here, it got us through some shit. And for that, I'm grateful for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when do you think that occurred for you that you were able to identify, like, this isn't working for me anymore?
Yeah. The shift really happened in therapy, in that process when I was like, I hold so many strong feelings toward people in my life early on who were truly doing the best that they could. I adapted my way of behaving to try to please everyone around me and make my own life easier, and so I realized that I don't want this to be my forever. And more importantly, I also come from one whole side of my family is suffers with alcoholism, right? So I was like genetically predetermined to have issues with alcohol at some point in my life just from that. But I started thinking about the patterns of behavior that someday when I have a family, hopefully I have children, I don't want to pass these things on to them. So my grandparents were alcoholic, or my grandfather still is. My mother, my uncle, all struggle with alcohol. And I said, they didn't disrupt the pattern. My grandpa didn't disrupt it for his kids. My parents aren't disrupting it for me. So I am responsible for saying, before I bring children into this world, how do I want my mental space to be, right? Like, what things do I want to have healed so that I just don't generationally pass on these traumas, and I think that responsibility helped me gain a lot of clarity, but also responsibility for my healing and saying, like, this isn't just about me. This is about my future family, and my kids, hopefully someday, don't deserve to come into this life already set up to have these obstacles. Like, if I can do my part to diminish some of these things so that they're, not going to come into a world where they're set up to have anxiety and set up to have, problems with alcohol or people pleasing or perfectionism, like, I need to do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's absolutely important. And, as myself working as a therapist, that's something that we often see is, that cycle repeating where, because maybe a parent doesn't understand or doesn't realize what they're doing to their child, then, it just continues to be passed down. So I think that's great that you really made that focus and intention into stopping that cycle from continuing.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to talk more about trauma and anxiety and how they're related.
Hmm. Yes. So most people don't, the average person kind of has this idea in their head that like trauma is something that happens to people who have been in a war, right? Like that's just kind of our overarching idea of what trauma is. And we do need to give a lot of credit to, like the VA and certain programs that have done a lot of research on war veterans or people who have served overseas and things like that, and the impact it has on their mental health, because it's brought us a long way in the trauma world. And so being someone who specializes in trauma, I think the biggest thing that people don't understand is that, first of all, trauma is an anxiety disorder. It falls under that category, which obviously but our listeners probably don't. But it's this idea that you and I could be in the same experience. The same exact thing could happen to us, right? Like we're both passengers in a car that gets in a car accident. And I might walk away completely traumatized, unable to get in a car again for a while, like need to do intensive therapy, all of these things. And you might walk away completely mentally fine, same as you were before, right? And
Mhm.
trauma comes down to resiliency, our ability to bounce back after things happen to us. So this whole concept that, well, it wasn't that bad or other people have it worse drives me insane, because you cannot compare traumas. You cannot compare going overseas and going to war to a car accident. Like it's completely different. And there's no like, oh, you have to have had something this bad, quote unquote, in order to qualify for trauma. No. If something happens to you and it changes how you live your life from that moment forward, that's trauma. And I think that, in the next 50 to 100 years, how we talk about trauma is going to be so different, because being a trauma therapist, I've never worked with a client who doesn't have trauma, who does not have something that has happened in their life that changed them. We all have that, right? Whether it be a loss, a great disappointment, of some form of abuse or moving, or, like we have things happening to us constantly that can be considered trauma. The problem is not everybody is going to meet criteria to have something like post-traumatic stress disorder. So I don't say it on like oh yeah, you have trauma and you have PTSD. No, like you had a situation happen in your life that changed you. That is trauma. That's what that is essentially. And so I like to just like break it down. And I want trauma to be a thing that we talk about like we do anxiety or depression, but it feels so scary. It's like somebody is going to open this can of worms if I ask them about their trauma and I'm not going to know what to do with it. Like that's the way our society works, is if you are about to share an emotion that's going to make me uncomfortable, I want no part in it. So we try to like shove it. You don't need to talk about it. It wasn't that bad. And as humans, we've adapted that to learn to minimize our experiences and say, it wasn't that bad. I don't need to talk about it. I don't need to go to therapy, because we're so afraid of the judgment from everybody else that are going to go, wait, I've been in a car accident and I can still drive, and that's the
Mhm.
piece people don't understand, is that resiliency factor of, yeah, that happened to me and you, but I couldn't bounce back and you did. And that's, if people could understand one thing, I would have it be that.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and that can take away a lot of the shame and stigma people feel from experiencing trauma. Because
Yes.
I definitely agree with what you're saying, that it's not what happened to you, it's how you respond to it,
Exactly.
and everybody's
Exactly.
going to respond differently.
Hmm.
And
Right.
I think there's definitely those expectations that, like you said, you need to be in a war or experience something, really traumatic and severe, but that's just not the case.
Yes, exactly. Like I don't have a PTSD diagnosis, but I did a year of EMDR, which is intensive trauma therapy, because I had life experiences that were still impacting me, and that, I think that's just like the piece that people have such a hard time wrapping their heads around. And it's hard to admit that you have trauma because of that judgment.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, what would you say is your advice for somebody who's experiencing anxiety and maybe they're not sure if what they've experienced has been traumatic for them.
Totally. I would just say it probably is trauma. You've been through something in your life that caused you to maybe cope in an unhealthy way or change how you trust people or interact with others. And like, therefore that's trauma. But I would say, first of all, everyone deserves therapy. Everyone needs to be in therapy because, and I say that not because I think there's something wrong with you or that you're broken and you need to be fixed, but I cannot think of one single human on this planet, no matter what they've done, choices they've made, what their mental health looks like, who does not deserve a safe space. A safe space that is free from judgment, that is free from bias, to just feel heard and accepted and understood and validated and encouraged and supported. Like every single person on this planet deserves that. And so my biggest piece of advice and why I love the coaching work that we do is because it makes those kinds of services and safe spaces available to more people who aren't quite ready to say, yeah, I think I need a therapist, but they kind of need to like bridge the gap sometimes or have something that feels less intense, right? So someone who listens to my podcast, for example, and feels connected to me might feel safer in my coaching programs because they feel like we've already built up a relationship, whereas going and hiring some professional to just like start probing in their life might feel really scary and intimidating. And so I would just say everybody deserves that space, and whatever it looks like, finding somebody to hold safe space for you that's completely free from judgment is vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely important, because I think that a lot of people feel that maybe they don't deserve to go to therapy, or maybe they're doubtful about if they need therapy or coaching. And, I think there can be a difference in those two spaces where people might feel more comfortable, like you said, because they already are consuming your content and are comfortable with you and your approach. Mm-hmm. And so they might feel more comfortable going to you and coaching versus seeking out a therapist that they don't know. Because I think that trust factor is really important when you're being vulnerable and sharing details about your past and your history.
Exactly. You're so right.
So I think that there might be people on that note who might be hesitant or scared to reach out for help or ask for therapy. Is there anything related to maybe the trauma that they've experienced that might make it harder for people to ask for help?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Factors that make it difficult to ask for help. One, it's just generally not accepted by society. Two, it's exceptionally difficult for men. Like this whole like joke that men never ask for directions and men don't read the instructions when they're building that bookshelf from IKEA. And, it's not just a joke. Like there's truth to it. Men are supposed to be able to always figure it out on their own. Culturally, there's a lot of various cultures that still, like, as a whole, don't really believe in mental health, like don't think it's a thing. Generationally, factors of like older generations tend to be more pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just get shit done. You don't ask for help, you just figure it out on your own. So there's a ton of factors that go into this. And one of the biggest things that I promote and teach in my programs is how to find safe space and support from people who are capable of giving it to us. So what we often try to do is, for me, for example, I used to try to go to the alcoholics in my family for support as I was trying to get sober and like figure out what my relationship with alcohol was going to look like. And then I kept trying to like, let's do this together. Come on. Like, don't you want to heal your relationship with alcohol? But they were not at that spot. They're years and years and years beyond me into their relationship with alcohol. So I was not going to be able to get them to do it with me, but I kept trying and exhausting myself. So I was seeking support from people who are not capable of giving it to me in that one life area. So what do? We find people who can support us in various life areas. For example, my husband knows nothing about mental health. He is very mentally well himself. He's never had anxiety. He's never dealt with depression. Like he is very, stable in terms of his mental health. And so when I was struggling and I was trying to get everything I needed from him, it put a lot of pressure and tension on our relationship because he could offer, an ear and try to like encourage me, but he couldn't give me that empathy that I was looking for of like, I truly know what you're going through. And so I had to find other outlets. Same as like, I don't talk to him about work a ton. It's very brief because I talk to other therapists about our work because they get it. So we need to be making sure that as I seek out to get various of my needs met, that I'm doing it from people who are capable of meeting those needs. That's why I love social media and I love the coaching space, because your family doesn't need to know about it. You can follow us, you can, absorb our content, you can connect with us, and that we are going to be capable of supporting you. So that's my favorite way to kind of get started, get acquainted with like seeing, in your Instagram feeds, some things about mental health start to pop up and changing the way that you think about it and approach it. It's easy to just continue avoiding and burying our big emotions related to our mental health because that's what we've learned to do. So if we try to seek support from people who don't get it, they're going to tell us to shove it basically in nicer words. Like, it's not that big a deal. Just think positive. Maybe you should try taking deep breaths. Like they mean well, but their support isn't going to meet our needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a great point. And I think it's not that, like you said, they mean well. It's not that their intention isn't to help you, but that they just don't have the knowledge and the capacity to help in that way.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And so you had mentioned social media. Mm-hmm. And, I know that one of your things on social media is being really raw and relatable. And, I think that definitely requires a lot of courage to put yourself out there like that. Was that something that was difficult for you to do?
Oh, it was the most painful. Like, I just got goosebumps with you asking me about it. I posted on, so I had a time in college where I was very depressed. The drinking was getting to me, and I had a point where I felt suicidal, and I never told my family about it. I never sought counseling. I just kept powering through and really trying to just get over it on my own. And so there came a point where it became necessary, I felt, in my journey to share about it on social media, to raise awareness. I had never told my family that I went through this period before I posted on social media, like flat out. There have been times I felt suicidal, and shared a little bit about my story, and the calls I got and the texts I was receiving and, the level, oh my God, I had no idea. And it's like, yeah, I was great at hiding it. And I'm sorry that this hurts you. Right. But that's the piece that we get scared to share things on social media because like, my mom wouldn't love that I talk about her drinking problem, right? Like, and I would feel bad that she would be hearing me talk about it, but I also need to speak my truth. Like, I feel this deep responsibility to be vulnerable, to blaze a trail and teach people nothing bad has happened to me since starting to share. I get some criticism now and then, mostly in relation to the fact that I swear a lot. But for the most part, people are really supportive. People crave vulnerability. Like the same old think positive, good vibes, like just be happy, life's too short, YOLO shit is getting old. People want to see and hear like, oh shit, I'm not crazy. Other people think and act and feel like I do, but nobody talks about it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's bizarre, especially this point. 2020 has been the weirdest year of our lives. We're in a election year. I think it's not fair that people can put their political views on blast on the internet, but I can't talk about my mental health. So I'm trying to my number one goal, my kind of motto is increase awareness and lower stigma, normalize it as if I had a broken bone. I wouldn't try to hide it from social media if I broke my leg. Why am I going to hide it from social media because I had a panic attack? Those need to be on equal playing fields. And the only way we get there is by modeling that, showing that it's okay, that it's going to be accepted, and doing it.
Yeah. And I think it's great that you highlighted that distinction between you wouldn't hesitate to put out there that you broke a bone or something physical happened. But there's still that ingrained stigma of sharing something about your mental health. And, I'm curious if yourself being a licensed counselor, if that's something that makes it even harder for you, or if you've encountered any barriers in regards to being vulnerable and being a professional.
Right. I don't share my social media platforms with my clients voluntarily. I don't use my full name. I don't promote my podcast to them, things like that. So that doesn't mean that a quick Google search couldn't find me everywhere, right? And so I do keep it in the back of my mind, like as I put things out there, is there anything that if a client heard all of this, I wouldn't be okay with it? And at the end of the day, I kind of always just do that gut check, and there's really nothing, I work in, like I said, the co-occurring chemical dependency mental health world as well. And I work with therapists who openly share that they are in recovery from their addictions. And I thought, because I have anxiety, I overthought about this, but I thought if anybody ever came to me, like my supervisors in the past knew that I did a podcast, they knew that I was sharing on social media, and there was never an issue with it. I don't know that I maybe necessarily shared the extent of it, but they had the idea. And I thought if anybody, client or otherwise, came to me and said, I found your podcast, like, holy shit, you're a disaster, I would be able to say, how is that any different than a counselor who has a previous addiction and now says, oh, I'm 13 years in recovery. I'm almost 2 years in recovery from ever having a panic attack, so why is that different? And so that kind of became my justification that I needed in order to continue sharing really openly and vulnerably, because I didn't want there to be a double standard. I need to be able to help my clients understand. And if they, ever asked, I probably wouldn't volunteer information about my mental health, right? I would say, why is that important to you? Or, whatever, why, that we're here for you. I'm curious how this might impact our relationship if I did have anxiety or things like that. But to me, it's worth a little bit of risk to know. Like I have had a client whose dad found my podcast and he mentioned it and said, I've had a few clients' parents find me on the internet. But his only complaint was that I swore too much. He's like, you have really great content, but wow, you use the F-bomb a lot. And I was like, okay, like, is that really the worst thing? Like this guy who's probably in his 60s just found my podcast and listened to it, and I don't hold back, and nothing happened. He didn't want his daughter to stop seeing me. He didn't want to speak to somebody else in the agency. It's like, it was fine. So I found that proof that my anxiety needed to be like, okay, worst case scenario, someone found the podcast, it happened, nothing bad happened, right?
Yeah. And I think that really demonstrates that you're breaking down those barriers of the stigma and normalizing it so that other people do feel more comfortable and more heard in sharing their stories.
Yes.
And I think, you definitely pointed on a piece there in regards to anxiety, that it's kind of paradoxical, but it's like the anxiety is making it harder for you to share about your anxiety because you said you were thinking of the worst case scenario, and like what would happen. So what do you think was like the thing that helped you to get through that anxiety about sharing about your anxiety?
Totally. It was healing for me. And it's been healing for me. That is why I continue to do it, because as much as I want to help others, sharing openly, being accepted, normalized, validated by other people on the internet who are going through similar things has been so therapeutic for my own journey. And being reminded that I'm not alone. Every time I got scared to post something, every time I was like, do I really publish this podcast episode right now? All of those thoughts, it was just like, if even one person can relate to this and reminds me that I'm not alone, it will have been worth it. And that helped me just break that wall down and continue doing what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's awesome to hear. I want to discuss trauma a little more. And, can you tell me what advice would you have for listeners who have experienced trauma themselves and maybe they're not sure what to do or how to cope with it?
Yes, absolutely. My biggest thing is I want to break down really quick into a few steps how to find a therapist, because that was like the most intimidating part of the process for me. Being a therapist, I was like, well, I don't want to go to a therapist of a place that I might ever want to work at. I don't want to work with a therapist who's as young as I am. Like I don't want it to feel like a peer relationship. I knew I wanted someone older. I knew I wanted a woman, right? So I had all these things, but then I'm like, how do I, for most of us, that could be enough to just pause us and be like, yeah, I'm not going to do it, right? There's too many barriers already. So what I always tell people is you need to do this thing first. You need to connect with your insurance and figure out who's in your network. Once you do that, then you say, oh, for me, it was like, it's like mental health clinics of Minnesota or something, right? Like might find a place like that. And then I would go to that website knowing those providers are in my network and read their bios and look at their pictures. Almost every single agency has photos and bios of their therapists because they know that's important to their future clients. And so I started reading bios. I found someone who specialized in anxiety, was an older woman, had been in the field for like 30 years. I was like, heck yeah, this is my girl. And then I scheduled an appointment. So I think breaking down how to find a therapist is important too. At practicality, if you're not interested in going to therapy, what would be my best advice for coping? A few things. One, finding a way to not feel so alone. Mental health can be so isolating. So my news feeds are full of other therapists and people who share openly about their mental health. And like if you open my Pinterest, it's nothing but quotes about mental health, right? Like I make sure that I'm constantly finding that validation and that normalization of mental health too. So even on your social media platforms, I think it can be vital to make sure you're following accounts that make you feel safe. Also, in coping with trauma, essentially why trauma impacts us is because it overstimulates our fight or flight response. And the part of your brain that is meant to keep you alive, that tells you when you're hungry, that tells you when you need to go to sleep, that tells you when to run away, when you're flying down the highway and brake lights happen in front of you and you have to slam the brakes. We don't pause and like think about it, like what's going to happen if that car 10 feet in front of me who's hitting their brakes, and if I don't hit my brakes, like what will happen? No, our brain just like puts us into action, right? It's an adrenaline rush that kicks us into high gear so that we can save ourselves. That's our survival brain. And what happens with trauma is that's overstimulated. So my brain interprets situations where I'm not actually unsafe as super unsafe, and then it releases adrenaline and stress hormones so that I can take action, but it's not being used because I'm not actually in a dangerous situation. So then I'm sitting there with all of this tension and stress built up that I didn't need to exert to save my life, right? And so all of that makes me want to, I move my body every single day. I am a huge fan of 30 minutes of exercise every single day. I make sure that I do simple things like checking in with myself. Am I anxious right now? What might be impacting that? Is this a trauma response, right? Like for me, still being around alcohol kicks me into like survival mode because it's a fearful thing for me. My brain's like, oh shit, what's going to happen if somebody gets too drunk or, whatever. So we need awareness. But I think that understanding of like, your brain is just trying to protect you. It's trying to save you, because it's really easy to judge it and be like, I have such a hard time regulating my emotions or staying calm. But your brain is wired to just think that you're in danger all the time. Like the part of your brain that's literally just trying to keep you alive is working overtime. So give yourself a little bit of grace, to be able to say, okay, but scratch everything else. The biggest thing that I could say is you need to change your biochemistry. When you're having a trauma reaction, when your body kicks into overdrive like that because of your brain thinking you're in danger, you need to move your body. You need to change the temperature of your body. These are DBT skills that I love. Intense exercise, changing the temperature of your body, like submersing your face or your hands into ice water, or I live in Minnesota. So in the winter, you just step outside for 30 seconds and come back in. But if you can change the temperature of your body, if you can expend some of that energy, or you could do like muscle relaxation or deep breathing, all of those things are going to remind your brain that you're safe. Remind your brain that it doesn't need to be in fight or flight, that survival mode isn't necessary right now, right? Like those are my practical tips for what like you could implement right now when that happens. But first you have to have the awareness. Otherwise, you can't use a coping skill if you don't know that you're needing it.
Totally. Yeah. But I think those are a lot of great tips and things that people can do because, there is that piece of awareness. And then there's also that piece where when people are feeling really anxious or, overwhelmed or emotional, they don't know what to do. And so those can be great physical things to do to get them out of that stress. And I think a thing that you touched on that a lot of people don't realize is that trauma is really physical and it's held in the body. And so, those things you mentioned, like exercise or changing your temperature, can be really helpful in things that people don't think of.
Yes, game changers for sure.
Totally. So I have two questions that I'm planning on asking each guest. So my first question is what helps you to cultivate calm?
I love that. This might be counterintuitive to a typical response or what someone might think, but I'm very accepting of all of my emotions. So I don't believe in striving for nothing but happiness, right? Like this idea that the goal and to know when you've quote unquote made it in life is that you're happy all the time does not sit well with me. And I do not want it to sit well with others because we're setting ourselves up for failure by believing that's the goal. So I cultivate calm by acknowledging and accepting without judgment all of my emotions. So rather than, I feel anxious and I'm like, God damn it, I don't have time for this right now. Like what is wrong with my body? Like, why is my mind racing? What is going on in my environment that's triggering me? I don't get like that anymore. I don't have those, and it might be a gut reaction that I might have those judgments, but I'm quick to reframe it and come back around and go, what's my body trying to communicate with me? What does my body need in this moment? How can I respect what's going on with me, right? And removing that judgment allows that emotion to work its way through me, get a need met that I wasn't previously meeting. It could have been something as simple as like, I slept like shit last night. So tonight I need to make sure that I get a more full, restful night of sleep, or I'm hungry, or it might be something super basic that I just would have spent so much time being upset about that feeling. And instead, I just acknowledge it and speak to myself with kindness and grace and like, oh, wow, I'm feeling a lump in my throat and having tears well up. I'm going to let that flow through me. I'm going to like allow myself space to cry, even though being sad's not my favorite thing. My body is always communicating with me. And when I think about it that way, it allows me to just accept it as it is and then move forward. So that for me is cultivating calm, is accepting that I'm going to have a full spectrum of emotions and that's what's meant for me, not just because I thought when I was first diagnosed with anxiety that like the goal was going to be to just never feel panic again, to like, I was like, I never want to have a panic attack again. And I've been able to achieve that, but only by accepting the full range of emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that reframe that you had mentioned of checking in with yourself and asking yourself, like, what does my body need in this moment? I think that can be really important.
Yes.
And, that focus of not trying to resist those emotions, but really leaning into them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
My second question is, what's the number one piece of advice that you want to give the audience regarding anxiety?
I think the biggest thing that I can say about life with anxiety is it can feel so isolated, so lonely to have these thoughts. Like if I could just list out some of the wild thoughts that I've had as a result of my anxiety disorder, I swear no one else would ever feel crazy again. Right. But that's what happens because we don't talk about it. We don't say like things like, oh my gosh, I've been married to my husband for 3 months now, and I wanted a divorce last night because my brain was going like, that's not cute. Nobody talks about that stuff because I woke up this morning and then I was fine and he was just irritating me yesterday, right? Like something was going on. But we assume that we're the only ones who've ever had thoughts like this. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is you're not as unique as you think you are in the way that you think. And other people, if you look for it, people like us are out there sharing, you know, hey, we hear you, we feel you, we see you, we are you. Like
Hmm.
we're right in this too. And I would just want to normalize and validate that anxiety.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely agree that that's really important. And I think what you had mentioned with the thoughts, because I think I was on Twitter a few weeks ago and I saw a post of somebody saying, like, post your weirdest intrusive thought. And people were posting all these thoughts, and I was relating to a lot of them. And I was like, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but it's really eye opening that you really think that you're the only one when in reality, you're not.
Exactly. Yes, totally.
So I know that you have a coaching program. Are you still accepting new clients for that, or can you tell us more about the program?
I can tell you all about it. So the first round is currently closed. It will be launching again sometime before the year is over. So I have a brand new intensive 3-month healing program. It covers 3 categories. So each month is its own category, and then each week is a subcategory. So in the first month, we are learning all about the way that we think, how to reframe our thoughts versus chronic positivity, because I think that's a distinction that a lot of people don't understand. In the second month, we dive all into feelings. How do we make space for all of our emotions? How do we kind of get our needs met that way? How do I express my feelings in a healthy way? And then in month 3, we dig into like a messy healing action plan. So we're setting boundaries. We're making sure that our needs are going to be met moving forward beyond the program too. And in that, each week has a coaching video where I have a whiteboard and I'm, presenting on a certain topic. And then there's a workbook that I custom created to go along with it. So for the whole 3 months, you're going to have weekly and daily prompts to make sure that, because what I hear so often is I hear what you're saying. Like, I know the skill logically, I know what it is, right? I know how to set boundaries, or I know how to be more assertive or use a certain coping skill. I don't know how to implement it. And that's the gap that we bridge in the program, because I'm having you practice the things as you're learning them throughout. So by the end of the 3 months, you're going to feel like a totally different person because you've actually made lasting changes. So I'm not to toot my own horn, but these are the things that I'm doing to maintain a really healthy, healing lifestyle. And they're things that I've learned sitting as the client in the therapy office, being a therapist. So we've condensed it all into a really intensive 3 months, but it's awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great. So how can people find out more about that program if they're interested?
Yes. So a couple of ways. My Instagram is where I hang out the most. I love my Instagram. I'm constantly, putting up mini healing sessions on my stories or IGTVs every single week. So at The Anxious Therapist on Instagram, or The Anxious Therapist podcast. I talk about my programs on the podcast and on my Instagram. Like, the people in my Instagram stories are going to be the first to know every time. So
Hmm. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, and you shared a lot of great information about trauma and anxiety that I know is going to be helpful for our listeners.
I'm so glad. Thank you for having me. It was truly my pleasure.